What's going on, Raptors fans? I'm tapping in with you guys today to talk about trades. So, the trade market this year is, I think, the place where you're probably going to see the biggest move for the Raptors offseason. We're not going to make any crazy, splashy signings. The draft is come and gone. The trade market is really the focus for big change that could occur for the Raptors. So, as always, I'm going to try to walk you guys through what I'm thinking, what I see, and just the different parts of the Raptors' current situation that I think could lead to some hints as for what they might do. So, as always, I like to think about money and I like to start with the finances and the cap sheet and see where it takes us. So, the place I'm going to start with is looking at the salary cap for the next 3 years. So, not this upcoming year, but the 3 years after that, as well as the luxury tax figures. And then some of the contracts we have on the books and what it would look like if we paid our players past their existing deals. So, the salary cap this year, I mean, I don't have it listed in front of me, but I believe it's at 136. So the last CBA that they put in place capped increases of the salary cap by 10%. So that's the biggest jump we'll ever see from this point going forward up until 2030. What I've done is I've factored for that 10% jump just because I think a TV deal is coming up soon, and that's a big influx of revenue and just more and more ways that gambling get involved in sports. That's another big windfall of cash. So with that being the case, I'm going to assume that 10% jumps occur. So the three figures of 149, 164, and 181 are factoring for those 10% jumps. Then I have the luxury tax figures. So that formula is a little bit less precise. If you look into it, what people say is that the luxury tax is usually 120% of the salary cap. So that's effectively what I've done. All the luxury tax figures there, 179, 197, and 217 are the are 120% of the corresponding salary cap figures. So what I've done in terms of including the contracts is I've included Pascal Siakam, Gary Trent Jr., Jakob Poeltl, Fred VanVleet, OG Anunoby, Scotty Barnes, and Chris Boucher. So this is not a big set of players. I've named, 7 players? So if we look at how the contracts of those 7 players would age, if we paid them what I think are reasonable estimates, like not particularly lofty or cheap, I think just fair estimates, this is what it looks like. So if Pascal Siakam gets a max contract after this upcoming year, which is the last year of his deal, he'll get 35% of the salary cap and then 8% increases beyond that. So you get 52, 56, and 60. So those are very exact numbers because you can actually get a pretty good estimate of what that would look like. And then what I've done beyond that is giving Fred VanVleet a 3-year, $30 million a year deal this offseason. Again, just an assumption. I know there's rumors about bigger deals being available for him. I'll believe it when I see it. That's the deal that Kyle Lowry signed, who was a little bit more than a little bit, but a more established player in free agency. He signed that in a smaller salary cap offseason with a smaller salary cap. So assuming Fred gets that 3 years, $90 million deal, just put flat figures for all these deals because these are rough estimates, and even just roughly looking at the salary situation gets the point across that I'm trying to make. So you got Fred for being that this is a longer term outlook, and this is looking at not this upcoming season, but the next year onwards. You have 2 years of that 3-year deal for VanVleet on the books for $30 million. You have OG Anunoby for the whole 3-year period. So I'm assuming when his contract runs out, we would give him a 4-year deal, $30 million a year. Then I have Gary Trent Jr. They've talked about there being an extension. Again, I don't know whether that's happening, but I'll believe it when I see it. For the sake of this exercise, though, I've given him a 20-year deal after this upcoming season. 3 years, flat deal. There is also Jakob Poeltl's deal. I'm assuming as a free agent this offseason, maybe he gets a 4-year deal, $20 million, something like that. And then, lastly, there's Chris Boucher's 1 year. That's the last year of his deal. I'm assuming it comes off the cap sheet at that point. And then the last deal is Scotty Barnes. So Scotty Barnes is here at 10 million. I believe his salary is 10 million and a 10.8. So that figure then turns into a 30-year deal. Again, like that may be a bit cheap, but just throwing those figures out there, right? So that's how I've arrived at these numbers. So even without precisely looking at the math, if you just eyeball it, right, that first year you're looking at about like $70 million worth of salary for 7 players, and they're only 9 million off the luxury tax. So that's a pretty unworkable, right? You look at the next column over, you're looking at about 186 million in salary. They're 11 million off the luxury tax with 6 players. And then the last column, you're looking at 160 against the cap. They're only 57 off the cap, but those are literally just 5 players. So the point of this exercise is simply just to say we have a lot of money on the cap going forward with the players that we have and the way their contracts are set up. So are we going to pay everybody? The answer is no. People are going to have to go. In the situation we're at as a roster, it's probably not the smartest to just let players leave in free agency. There's a wasted opportunity there, and you're just gashing value. Strictly from an asset management standpoint, there's no point in letting people leave. If we can't afford to pay them, specifically in this case where we know we can't do that, you should be able to plan ahead. You should be able to trade players. You should be able to get value. So we know we can't pay people. This is not even a basketball conversation or decision at this point. It's strictly financial. They cannot be paid to go deep into the luxury tax with it for a team that's not good. They cannot be they should not be let to leave in free agency. That should not happen. So it's pretty clear. Guys have to get traded, right? I probably could have said that without unpacking all this initially, but I just wanted to be thorough and kind of unpack all the different avenues of why there's just no escaping the fact that people have to be traded, but they have to be traded specifically in the context where we save money. Now, as a team that's trying to get better, how do you save money and get better? The answer is quite simple, but you trade for talent on rookie deals. You look to acquire talent that's going to come in early in the first 4 years of their rookie deals and are going to play well to a level that's higher than those cheap rookie deals. That's pretty much the one avenue that we have to pursue as a franchise, because the reality is if we're trading for players that are established veterans that are worth less than the salaries that we're trading, we're probably getting worse players. So we're still a bad team at that point. If we're trading for players that are worth more, we have to take quite a big jump to get to the point where it's actually worth the money we're spending. So we have to really be robbing teams in those trades. The simple way of looking at things is we have to trade players. We have to save money. So just put 1 and 1 together. We have to trade for talent that's on a rookie deal. So what I've done now is I've looked through the whole NBA for assets that kind of fit the formula that I've put together. So the formula is this, right? I look for players that are from the 2021 draft, the 2022 draft, and the 2023 draft. Why? Because they are going to, to different degrees, give us that cap relief. So the people drafted in the 2021 draft, they're going to be on cheap money this year or this upcoming year, where we still need some cap relief because we're up against the luxury tax, but for one of these years in the future. Players in the 22 draft are going to provide cap relief for 2 of these years in this like long-term outlook on things. And players drafted in the 2023 draft, it's pretty unrealistic to expect to trade for people that were just drafted. But that being said, like, I don't think things are so settled in Portland. So until Dame gets traded, I still assume that Scoot can be gotten. Obviously, that would be a very, very difficult thing to do. I'm not just throwing that out there lightly, but the reality is aside from Scoot Henderson being awesome, he'd be awesome on a rookie deal. So That would give us cap relief for the whole of these 3 years. And that's what I think makes those players particularly valuable to our situation. I looked at players from those 3 years as assets that are particularly good for us. Then what I've also looked at are draft picks from the next 2 years. Now, I could have gone further, but the reality is it's hard to project where teams are going to be at 3, 4, 5 years in a row, but those also don't really impact your team for a long time. So I don't think there's a lot of value in projecting that. What I've done is I've looked at draft picks for the next 2 drafts because you can kind of get a feel for where rosters are going to be at for the next 2 years and teams that you could expect to be good and teams that you could expect to essentially be lottery teams. It's a little bit easier to do than teams 3, 4, 5 years down the road. So basically, that's like a 5-year window of assets that I've looked at in the league. I've combed through the ones that I think are valuable, draft picks that give us a chance to get lottery picks, and prospects that are in a situation where they're gettable, right? So they're not young players that are just performing so well that their teams wouldn't trade them, but they're also not young players that have done nothing to show any type of value and aren't worth giving a second chance to. So this is what I've done to assemble, I guess, a trade value guide to highlight the assets in the NBA that I think are particularly valuable to us given our cap situation. So, ta-da, this is it. I guess I'll start from the top. Houston, they have an unprotected Brooklyn pick in 2024. So while Brooklyn was a playoff team, they largely were a 6 seed based on wins earlier in the season when they had Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. That's a team that faltered quite a bit down the stretch. Obviously, they're not a barren team completely. Like, they have good players, but I think they have players that may get flipped in trades at some point, because I don't think players like Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson are going to necessarily love the idea of Brooklyn being their future, especially with where the roster's at. Like, they have some talent, but I think they're ripe to be picked apart as the year goes on in the trade market. So with Houston having an unprotected Brooklyn pick, I think there's a chance that Houston could, not specific to the draft pick, but as a franchise, could look at it like, look, we had a great draft in terms of drafting prospects with hype. We already had quite a bit of prospects on the team. We have a new coach. We can part with future assets for maybe a win-now player. From the Raptors' perspective, if you trade them a player that makes them better, that doesn't hurt the draft pick you just traded for because you're trading for Brooklyn's pick. So there's a scenario in which maybe that's something that materializes for an OG trade or something, right? You could get that draft pick. San Antonio, so they have in 2025 a top 10 protected Chicago pick. So that's a little ways down the road, and that pick might get protected. As is, even if it doesn't, that pick is going to be a lottery pick 11 to 14, because I don't think Chicago is going to be good, especially in 2025. The fact that they just paid Vooch, like, they're locking into a squad that I don't think is good. And if anything, DeMar is going to be a couple years older. Like, that pick, I don't think it'll be a playoff team. They won't be a playoff team in 2024 or 2025. They might be in the top 10, but then the appeal there is that it's top 8 protected in 2026. So you have 2 opportunities to get a fairly high pick there. And in all actuality, right, it's not I probably would never happen just sheerly out of just completely based on shame and just embarrassment. But the reality is San Antonio could trade us our pick back. Like, they could provide us value by just letting us have our pick regardless of where it falls, because I know we have it protected, but it wouldn't happen. But it is value they can present us, and both these picks in particular are picks that don't impact San Antonio at all. So if we make them better, we don't have to care about that impacting the draft pick we just traded for. The next team I have here is New York. So New York, they have their own picks in 2024, 2025 to trade. They could only trade one of them because that's just a rule. You can't trade your back-to-back of your own picks at all in the NBA. And then they also have a couple picks from other teams that could be valuable. They have a top 10 protected pick by Dallas, which has a chance to convey. I don't think Dallas is very good, but also Luka wouldn't let them be in the top 10 necessarily. Like, of course, they did it this year, but I think he'd probably keep them up. So you have a chance to get a lottery pick there. They have a Washington pick that has less and less protections as time goes on. Washington's in the East, so they might win. They might win some random games and not necessarily be that bad in one of these years. But of course, like again, if you're trading for a pick in 2026, you don't get that much value anytime soon. The next team I have is OKC. So this one is really interesting. So I'll leave the most interesting pick for last. So they have their own picks 2024, 2025. Again, they could only trade one. They have a lottery protected Miami pick in 2025. The appeal there is though it's unprotected in 2026. So with an aging Miami roster just getting a couple years older, that could be a really good pick and a really valuable pick that even if the Raptors had, they could flip it in and improve their roster through that avenue. But the most interesting thing is they have a top 4 protected Houston pick. But the thing with this pick is that if it doesn't convey, if Houston's pick falls in the top 4, it becomes 2 second-round picks. So this pick is literally a gamble. Literally, regardless of where they fall in the lottery teams, if their ball is drawed from the lottery, their pick will not convey and it will become 2 second-round picks. If it doesn't get picked from the lottery, then that pick is going to become a first-round pick wherever it is. So I wouldn't be opposed to taking that gamble because you could get a lot of value for cheap because I think OKC would have to not consider that pick first. You'd have to acknowledge the fact that the gamble exists. But I would take the gamble. I could see Houston maybe finishing 7 or 8 in the lottery and not winning, and that's a valuable pick. But the reality is they also could finish in the top 4. So yeah, you might be able to get a high pick for the cheap there. So I like that that avenue. And with OKC in particular, the reason I think they could trade draft capital is because one, we've already seen it happen. In the last couple of years, they've made 2 moves that I think were interesting. They traded 3 first-round picks for Ousmane Dieng. So the point there was, hey, we have a lot of picks. We can't use them all. So let's part with our volume of picks for quality. They did that for a young player. And then the trade they just made with Denver to part with a bunch of their picks, I think in the next 2-3 years for picks in 2029 and 2030. Again, they're having to manage the fact that they have so much draft capital. It doesn't make sense for them to be making draft picks right now with all the young players they have on their team. I swear they have like 11 or 12 first-round picks on their roster right now. So they might be willing to part with draft capital for a player like OG Anunoby or something. So they provide value in that scenario particularly. And then with Orlando, there's their 2024, 2025 picks and Jalen Suggs. Neither of these assets are all that enticing, I think. Obviously, with Jalen Suggs, he's a player that was drafted high that hasn't quite lived up to his potential. And their draft picks, to be honest, as a team, like being that they're in the Eastern Conference, they might just sneak into the play-in and might accidentally make the playoffs. They're a team that finished strong last year. They have actually a pretty cool vision. They're kind of like a Vision 6-9 team, but they actually pick big guards instead of just forwards. So, yeah, they might be good. Indiana obviously has Ben Mathurin, but I'm not even including him here because, frankly, he's probably just too good to consider them trading. They would trade to build around him. But they do have their own picks, and the reality is that as promising as they could still not be a playoff team next year, right? So if you get their draft pick, it could pan out to be decently valuable. But all things considered, they have their own picks. So if you trade them someone like OG and they become better, then ultimately they're probably a playoff team. That being said, though, had to put them on the list because they're still a franchise that does some weird things. Like the fact that Ben Mathurin was a bench player last year, I just don't understand. And of course he'll probably start, but sometimes they just do weird things. So that's why they're on the list. I got Portland next. Their assets being Scoot Henderson and Shaden Sharp. Like I said, I don't think it makes any sense for them to have Dame, Shaden Sharp, and Scoot Henderson on a team together. There's no point. You either trade Dame, build around the young players, or you trade the young players, build around Dame. So until Dame gets traded, I'm looking at it like those players could be gotten out of Portland. I don't think you could get both for one player, but I definitely think at least one of them could be gotten if the right trade materialized. And we heard rumors of Portland working on a Siakam deal and that falling apart because he didn't want to guarantee the fact that he would resign. How true that is, who knows? But the reality is the circumstances line up pretty well. They have young players that they can't really depend on to play with Dame on a contending team. And we have a set of older players that we don't necessarily see how are going to fit with the Scotty Barnes age group on our roster that's younger, that's probably the future of our team. So that could happen. The next team I have on the list is New Orleans, another team that could be looking to trade some of their younger players that they drafted recently for win-now players. Dyson Daniels, 8th overall pick in 2022. Trey Murphy, I don't know exactly where he was drafted, but he was a first-round pick in 2021. Yeah, these two are two players that have promise. These are players that we could get probably. So that's what I would expect if we made a trade with New Orleans. Dyson Daniels obviously would give us 3 more years on his rookie deal. Trey Murphy, 2 more years. I looked at New Orleans picks. They don't really have picks like that. But yeah, those players are intriguing. So definitely under consideration. Atlanta, a team that was tied to Pascal Siakam. Apparently, they've been trying hard to get him. Their asset is AJ Griffin, obviously. A player that we're familiar with because he hit a game winner against us last year. Golden State has Kuminga and Moody. So that situation also, the reality is they basically picked Draymond over Jordan Poole. So they already picked the older part of their team over the younger part. There's no point in stopping. You already gave up on Wiseman. I could imagine that these are players that could be gotten. They don't really have a plan for developing the young talent going forward. So I can't see them being closed-minded to trading these players for more established win-now talent. So that gets Golden State on the list. And finally, last but not least, Memphis. So Memphis, the team we hired our coach from, not only did we hire Darko, a random guy from the bench, we hired the talent development guy. We hired the guy whose responsibility was to work with young players to develop their game. So I'm assuming Santi Aldama and Zaire Williams are 2 players that he's familiar with, that he's worked with. He knows their games inside out, and he has an idea of what their potential looks like and what their development path looks like. So I think that's actually a pretty interesting circumstance for them because they're going to lose Dillon Brooks. As is, they're a team that's been a high seed in the West now, so they're looking to win. They need perimeter players. I could definitely see them being a candidate for OG. So given that they have 2 young players that aren't necessarily big guys in the rotation that our coach Darko would be familiar with, I definitely think that's also an interesting proposition. So this is how I decided to look at the trade market. Obviously, it would be more ideal if we had an exact idea of what was being offered for our players, what's actually realistic, what's not. But that's all information we just don't have access to. But even beyond that, I just think a good philosophy in these type of situations is why be reactive when you can be proactive? Like, if you have to trade players, why look at it as something where you have to sit back and just wait and see what other people dictate for your players and just kind of have a passive role in the whole thing? You can be proactive. You can look at your team. You can make an assessment of what you have. You can make an assessment of what suits you the best going forward. And then you can survey the rest of the league for the things that actively suit what you need. And I think that's kind of what I've accomplished specifically from a cap standpoint. Now, somebody with a higher expertise in basketball could probably do a similar exercise when looking for what we need from a basketball standpoint. And I'm sure that's what the front office is doing. So it'd be interesting to see how many of these pieces, considering the talents of the players that I've listed and the strengths of the draft classes in the next 2 years, how those things actually suit the basketball side of things. But I think I've done a pretty good job of exhausting the different kinds of assets in the league right now that suit us from a cap situation. So we'll see what happens. I think there's some potential for a good shakeup and a definite positive impact on the long-term outlook for the Raptors. But who knows? Who knows what Masai's vision is? Regardless of what happens, though, I'll be here. I'll be live reacting. Make sure you guys tap in. I'll see you guys around. If you like this video and want to support the channel, make sure you're pressing the like button, leaving comments, and subscribing to the channel. These are the kind of interactions that YouTube's algorithm looks for to figure out which content to push to the wider YouTube audience. So the more you guys interact, the more people these videos will get pushed to, the bigger the channel will get, the more content I can give you guys. So make sure that you're pressing the like button, leaving comments, and subscribing to the channel.